On a quiet afternoon, Rosie O'Donnell appeared on a podcast where the conversation flowed easily from celebrity anecdotes to politics. The hosts were relaxed, Rosie was in her element, and it seemed like another episode of casual chatter. But somewhere between the laughs and lighthearted commentary, she pivoted toward Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't an in-depth analysis, nor a thoughtful observation, it was more of an offhand comment. The kind of remark that comes out with a smirk. Rosie leaned closer to the microphone, laughed lightly, and asked, "Do people really think Jasmine Crockett is that smart?" The way she said it carried more weight than the words themselves. It wasn't a question, it was a dismissal. Those few seconds were subtle but telling. The hosts exchanged quick, nervous glances. They knew Rosie had crossed into territory that could spark backlash. To question someone's intelligence on a public platform, especially someone like Crockett, who was known for her sharp wit and strong presence, wasn't going to stay quiet. Rosie laughed off her own comment, shrugged, and moved on. But the damage was already done. Listeners caught it instantly, clipped it, and began sharing it online. Within hours, the clip circulated across social media with captions that ranged from disbelief to outrage. The thing about questioning intelligence is that it's never just about smarts. For someone like Jasmine Crockett, it touched something deeper. She was a woman in politics, a woman of color, and a fighter who had built her reputation on standing strong in heated debates and cutting through noise with clarity. For Rosie O'Donnell, an entertainer known for brash humor and bold takes, the comment may have seemed small, but to those who watched Crockett's rise, it was a slight that demanded attention. The reactions were instant and polarizing. Some of Rosie's longtime fans tried to brush it off, saying it was just Rosie being Rosie, the same comedian who had made a career of poking fun at everyone, but others weren't so forgiving. This is 2025, not the 1990s. One person tweeted, "You can't casually undermine a woman's intelligence and expect no pushback, especially not someone like Jasmine Crockett." The sentiment echoed across thousands of posts, with hashtags combining Rosie's name and Crockett's shooting into trending lists. Meanwhile, commentators began weighing in. Political analysts pointed out how dismissing Crockett's intellect was more than just a joke. It played into long-standing stereotypes. They reminded audiences of the moments Crockett had displayed razor-sharp arguments during congressional hearings, where her precision often left opponents scrambling for words. In contrast, Rosie's jabs seemed lazy, the kind of comment tossed out without much thought, but still carrying the power to stick. Behind the scenes, Rosie didn't immediately realize the wave she had set off. By the time her team flagged the viral clip, thousands of people had already dissected every syllable. Some even replayed it in slow motion, pointing to the smirk, the tone, the casual way she tried to pass it off. The conversation wasn't just about what Rosie said, but why she felt comfortable saying it. Did she underestimate how quickly Crockett's supporters would rally? Did she think Crockett wouldn't respond? Or did she believe her celebrity shielded her from accountability? In that moment, Rosie wasn't just a comedian making a comment, she was a veteran public figure throwing shade at someone who had been gaining influence and credibility. That contrast made the situation even sharper. On one hand, Rosie O'Donnell was a household name with decades of fame. On the other, Jasmine Crockett was an emerging powerhouse, carving her place in the political landscape with intellect and conviction. When Rosie questioned her intelligence, it felt less like banter and more like a clash of a risen old guard comedian testing the mettle of a new voice who wasn't about to shrink away. As the day turned into night, clips of Rosie's remark continued to spread. News outlets picked it up, framing it as the latest celebrity versus politician feud. Headlines used phrases like "Rosie takes aim" and "Crockett under fire," amplifying the sense of conflict. But what made the story stick wasn't just the words themselves. It was the way people anticipated Jasmine Crockett would respond. They knew her style. She wasn't someone who let remarks like this pass unanswered. They knew when her turn came, it would be something sharp, something unforgettable. And that expectation alone made Rosie's casual jab the spark of a fire that was only beginning to burn. When the clip of Rosie O'Donnell's remark reached Jasmine Crockett, the timing could not have been more fitting. She was preparing for a scheduled television appearance, a spot meant to highlight legislative updates and her perspective on current issues. The chatter about Rosie's words was already swirling online, and producers knew the audience would be waiting for Crockett to address it. She had a choice: ignore it and stay focused on policy, or seize the moment and show the country that she could handle shade without losing her cool. Crockett arrived at the studio calm, poised, and smiling as if nothing had shifted. But those who knew her understood that she never let a slight linger without answering it in her own way. When the host finally brought up Rosie's comment, it wasn't framed as an attack but as a point of curiosity. "Rosie O'Donnell questioned your intelligence on a podcast yesterday," the host said, carefully neutral. "What do you make of that?" The question hung in the air, the studio lights pressing down, the cameras rolling live. Instead of stiffening or letting any sign of irritation show, Crockett leaned forward in her chair, rested her hands gracefully, and smiled. Her expression told the audience she was not rattled, not even slightly caught off guard. In fact, It looked as if she had been waiting for this exact setup. Rosie O'Donnell questions my intelligence, she began, her voice measured and slightly amused. That's interesting. Rosie has made a career out of jokes. I've made a career out of facts, policy, and fighting for people who don't get invited onto comedy couches. Asterisk. The studio broke into laughter, not laughter directed at her, but laughter that sided with her, appreciating her ability to shift the balance. In those few lines, she had reframed the entire exchange. Rosie was suddenly the one standing on shaky ground, reduced to a punchline, while Crockett came across as focused and dignified. It wasn't about cruelty or striking back with venom, it was about drawing a clear line between entertainment and real leadership. Asterisk. What made Crockett's response so powerful was not only what she said, but how she said it. Her tone was steady, her pace deliberate, as though she was dissecting Rosie's comment with surgical precision. There was no rant, no raised voice, no insult hurled back. Instead, she calmly reasserted her own standing, contrasting her path against Rosie's in a way that made it clear she had the upper hand. She didn't need to drag Rosie through the mud. She only needed to point out the obvious differences in their roles. Asterisk. The clip of that response was immediately clipped, shared, and spread online just as Rosie's original remark had been. Social media users praised her for her composure, pointing out how icily she could have reacted with anger but instead chose wit. One user wrote, "Jasmine Crockett just gave a masterclass in how to handle shade, poised, witty, and undefeated." Another said, "Rosie should have known better. Crockett doesn't play the game. She rewrites the rules." Asterisk. Political commentators also weighed in. They noted how Crockett had managed to redirect the conversation back to her strengths. By drawing the line between jokes and policy, she reminded viewers that while Rosie's world revolved around entertainment, hers was grounded in real-world stakes. It was a subtle but brilliant move. She didn't just defend herself. She elevated herself while lowering the weight of Rosie's words. Asterisk. Even her body language played a role. Throughout the interview, she never once looked defensive. She smiled, gestured calmly, and radiated confidence. For viewers at home, it felt less like a defense and more like a teaching moment. Crockett had turned an insult into an opportunity to show who she was: sharp, thoughtful, and unbothered by celebrity digs. Asterisk. The reaction outside the studio confirmed it. Hashtags praising her response began to trend. Memes popped up celebrating her quick wit, and her words were replayed across multiple platforms. What stood out most was how she didn't just handle Rosie's remarks, she outclassed it. Rosie's jab had seemed flippant, but Crockett's reply had weight. It reminded people why she was respected, why her voice carried power in debates, and why dismissing her was a mistake. Asterisk. By the end of the day, the narrative had shifted. No longer was the story about Rosie's insult, it was about Crockett's composure and her ability to turn a slight into a statement. She didn't dodge the moment, nor did she let it consume her. Instead, she used it to prove a point. That intelligence isn't proven by snapping back in anger, but by demonstrating control and clarity in the face of provocation. Rosie O'Donnell's words might have sparked the moment, but it was Jasmine Crockett's response that defined it, and that was what people remembered. The moment that cemented Jasmine Crockett's response as legendary came with a single line. After laying out her calm comparison between Rosie O'Donnell's world of jokes and her own world of facts and policy, she paused just long enough to let the audience lean in. Then, with the same steady voice, she said, "I don't need Rosie O'Donnell to validate my intelligence, but if she wants a masterclass in how to think, speak, and win, she's welcome to pull up a chair in my office anytime." It was the kind of line that didn't just answer an insult, that transformed it into something larger, something that instantly felt unforgettable. Asterisk. The words landed with precision. In one sentence, she had done three things at once: dismissed the need for Rosie's approval, asserted her own authority, and offered a playful but pointed challenge that turned the tables completely. The crowd in the studio reacted with laughter and applause, and even the host raised an eyebrow, clearly aware that a viral moment had just been born. Crockett hadn't shouted, she hadn't thrown accusations, she had simply flipped the script with elegance. Asterisk. Online, the reaction was electric. Clips of her statement were replayed endlessly, captioned with bold text, "Pull up a chair." That phrase became a rallying cry for her supporters, a shorthand way of celebrating her ability to shut down an insult with style. Memes popped up overnight, images of office chairs with Crockett's quote plastered on them, gifs of celebrities pulling up chairs in mock agreement, even playful remixes that turned her words into music clips. It wasn't just a comeback, it became cultural currency. Asterisk. Commentators across platforms marveled at the finesse. Political analysts pointed out that Crockett's choice of words reflected not only confidence but control. She didn't simply retaliate, she invited Rosie into her world, where the rules were different. It was subtle dominance, wrapped in politeness, which made it sting all the more. Rosie, in this framing, wasn't the one with the upper hand. She was the one being offered a seat at a table where she clearly didn't belong. Asterisk. Journalists covering the moment noted how rare it was for a politician to land a line that could hold its own in both politics and pop culture. Most political comebacks are too stiff, too rehearsed, or too aggressive. Crockett's worked because it felt natural, quick-witted, and unforced. She didn't just defend her intelligence, she redefined the conversation, so that Rosie's comment looked trivial in comparison. Where Rosie's words had seemed petty, Crockett's line seemed monumental. The public loved it. But what made it more striking was Rosie O'Donnell's silence afterward. Normally quick to fire back, Rosie stayed quiet in the days that followed, avoiding the subject altogether. That silence only amplified Crockett's victory. People interpreted it as proof that Rosie had been effectively shut down, unable to match the wit and weight of Crockett's reply. In a world where back-and-forth feuds usually spiral out of control, the absence of a counterstrike made Crockett's words the definitive final note. Supporters of Crockett took this even further. On social media, activists and fans began using her line as a slogan for standing up against dismissal and condescension. Pull up a chair became a way of saying, if you doubt me, come and learn. It wasn't just about Crockett anymore. It became a message for anyone underestimated or undermined. That broader resonance is what pushed the line beyond being a clapback and turned it into something iconic. Even critics admitted the sharpness of the moment. Those who didn't always agree with Crockett politically still conceded that she had delivered a line for the ages. Some conservative commentators even joked that Rosie O'Donnell had given her an unintended gift, the chance to prove her wit on a national stage in a way that no scripted moment could have achieved. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Rosie's dismissal, meant to undermine Crockett, had ended up elevating her instead. In interviews afterward, Crockett was asked repeatedly about that one sentence. She didn't linger on it or try to milk it for more attention. Instead, she shrugged it off with a smile, saying, I said what needed to be said. That restraint only added to the legend. It showed that she didn't view it as a battle or a feud. She viewed it as a simple correction, a reminder of her place and her strength. That attitude made the line feel even more powerful because it wasn't about personal grudges, it was about setting the record straight. By the end of the week, the line was still being replayed everywhere from morning news shows to late-night comedy sketches. It had crossed over from politics into mainstream conversation. Everyone had heard it, everyone was talking about it, and everyone agreed on one thing. Jasmine Crockett had delivered a comeback that was destined to be remembered. In the days after Jasmine Crockett delivered her now famous comeback, the story took on a life of its own. What began as a passing remark by Rosie O'Donnell turned into a cultural conversation. Not because of Rosie's words, but because of how Crockett handled them. The aftermath revealed something bigger than just a clash between an entertainer and a politician. It showed the difference between a fleeting insult and a lasting impression. Rosie, known for being quick-witted and often unfiltered, had built a reputation over decades for never backing down from controversy. Yet in this case, after Crockett's masterful response, she stayed notably quiet. There were no follow-up jokes, no social media rebuttals, no second round of commentary. For someone like Rosie, silence was unusual, and that silence became its own headline. Commentators speculated that Crockett's reply had been so sharp, so definitive, that Rosie recognized there was no winning in prolonging the exchange. The more she spoke, the more she risked deepening the loss. Meanwhile, Crockett's words kept echoing. News outlets replayed the clip during panel discussions, and analysts praised her ability to keep her composure under pressure. On social media, her supporters turned her line into a badge of honor. Memes carried on the joke, but behind the humor was a serious point. She had reminded the public that intelligence cannot be diminished by a throwaway insult, and that dignity under fire often speaks louder than anger. The more people shared her words, the more her reputation grew, not just as a strong voice in politics, but as someone who could cut through noise without losing control. The contrast between Rosie's silence and Crockett's calm confidence defined the aftermath. Rosie looked smaller not because she was insulted in return, but because Crockett didn't need to attack her to win. She had taken the higher ground, while still landing a line that stung. It showed a new kind of strength, one that audiences across the spectrum could respect. Even people who didn't agree with Crockett's politics admitted that her handling of the situation was impressive. It wasn't just a win in the moment, it was a demonstration of how to navigate public scrutiny with both wit and grace. Supporters of Crockett began to point out how often women in positions of power face attempts to undermine their intelligence, and how rare it is for such moments to be turned around so effectively. Rosie's comment became an example of the broader dismissiveness that many women in politics face. Crockett's comeback, on the other hand, was held up as proof that it is possible to shut down those attempts without falling into bitterness. It became part of her larger story, reinforcing her brand as someone who was not only tough but also clever enough to handle insults without breaking stride. The ripple effects reached beyond the immediate news cycle. Commentators noted that Crockett had set a precedent for how public figures could handle shade. Instead of trading barbs or escalating, she had de-escalated with confidence, leaving Rosie with no room to maneuver. This wasn't just about scoring points, it was about showing discipline, timing, and awareness of how words can shape perception. Crockett's ability to keep control of the narrative elevated her in the eyes of many, especially younger audiences who valued authenticity and quick wit over rehearsed talking points. Rosie, by contrast, faded from the conversation. Her remark was still remembered, but only as the setup to Crockett's legendary response. What had started as Rosie's platform quickly turned into Crockett's moment. That shift was clear proof of who had truly won the exchange. And while Rosie chose not to comment further, her silence almost served as an acknowledgement that she had underestimated her opponent. The lasting image from the aftermath wasn't Rosie smirking into a microphone. It was Jasmine Crockett leaning forward during that interview, smiling as she delivered the line that turned everything around. That moment was replayed endlessly, cementing itself in the public memory. People weren't quoting Rosie. They were quoting Crockett. They weren't laughing at her. They were laughing with her. By the time the dust settled, Crockett had not only defended herself but also enhanced her public standing. The entire ordeal demonstrated the power of composure and clarity in a culture that often thrives on chaos and conflict. Rosie may have thought her question about intelligence was just another casual jab, but Crockett's response ensured that she, not Rosie, owned the conversation. In the aftermath, the narrative belonged entirely to her, and that was what made her comeback legendary. When the dust finally settled, the episode between Rosie O'Donnell and Jasmine Crockett left behind more than just a viral clip. It became a story of how quickly a casual remark can spiral into a cultural flashpoint, and how the response to that remark can define reputations. Rosie's question about Crockett's intelligence might have been tossed out as humor, but it revealed something larger: the way even when subtle, can trigger conversations about respect, credibility, and the weight of words. What stood out wasn't Rosie's comment, it was how Crockett chose to meet it. Her calmness set the tone. She didn't rush into defensiveness or swing wildly in retaliation. Instead, she used poise to take control, showing that a well-timed response can hold more power than an angry rant. Her legendary line about offering Rosie a masterclass wasn't just a comeback. It was a reminder that strength often lies in restraint, and intelligence often reveals itself in the ability to stay grounded when provoked. That's why her words resonated far beyond the immediate exchange. They became something people could use in their own lives, a kind of blueprint for dignity under pressure. Rosie's silence after the fact underscored that point. For someone known to clap back at critics, her decision to stay quiet was telling. It highlighted that not every battle can be won with more words, especially when the other side has already claimed the ground with clarity. In this case, silence was not neutrality, it was acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement only magnified Crockett's victory. The broader significance came in what people saw reflected in the moment. Women in politics are often measured against a harsher standard, where their intelligence and authority are questioned in ways their male counterparts rarely face. Crockett's response cut through that dynamic. She didn't just defend herself, she shifted the lens, showing that she wasn't playing defense at all. Instead, she reframed the exchange into one where she was the teacher, the authority, the one in control of the conversation. That reversal was what elevated her line into legend. As the story traveled through headlines, podcasts, late-night shows, and social media feeds, it stopped being about a feud between two public figures and became a parable about wit, composure, and the importance of standing tall when undermined. People repeated her words not just because they were funny, but because they carried a truth that applied far beyond the political stage. The power of a comeback isn't in cutting someone down, it's in lifting yourself up so high that the insult no longer reaches. In the end, Rosie O'Donnell's remark faded into the background, while Jasmine Crockett's response lived on. It was a reminder that intelligence can't be measured by a quip on a podcast, but it can be proven in the way one handles being underestimated. Crockett didn't just answer a question about her intelligence, she showed it in action. And that is why, long after the moment passed, her comeback remained exactly what people called it,